So let's get started setting up our backend to handle GraphQL requests. And I'm in my source code for my REST API. I'm looking at the routes.go file, and I'm going to set up a route here, but first let's get rid of these commented out routes because we don't need those anymore. There. And let's set up a route to a non-existent handler that will take care of our GraphQL requests. So router.handlerfunc, and it will be HTTP method post, because on the front end we'll be posting JSON to this route. And we'll set up the path name to the route being /v1/ and I'll just call it GraphQL. And we'll just do a really simple one to get started here. And we'll just say list. This will list the movies that are in our database. And we'll call a handler that doesn't exist yet, but we'll create that in the next step. App. And I'll just call it movies GraphQL. Doesn't really matter what I call it, but we'll go QL because that's the way they name it. Okay, so there's our route. Now let's go create a handler for this. So I'll create a file right in command API. So in this folder, /command/API, I'll create a new file and I'll just call it GraphQL.go. And it is, of course, in package main. And what we're going to do first, before we start writing the code, we actually need to implement or import a third-party package that will give us a much easier way of dealing with GraphQL. We could do it all by hand, but there's no point in reinventing the wheel, and there are a number of packages to choose from. And it really doesn't matter which one I choose, because people who are familiar with GraphQL, some will say, you picked a great package, good choice. And others will say, why didn't you use this one instead? So there's no way I can be right and satisfy everyone, so I'm just going to pick one. And the one I'm going to pick, I'll open a terminal window and clear the screen. So let's just go get one. Go get from github.com/GraphQL-go/GraphQL. And there it is. So that's been imported. And we're going to use this one for this example. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a package level variable. And I'm going to call it movies because we've never used that anywhere else in this package. And it's going to be a slice of pointer to models.movie. Okay, so that did the import for me, so that's good. Now, I'll create the handler itself, and then we'll have to do a whole lot of work to describe the kinds of data we're going to be handling or sending back from our code. So let's create the handler first, just to get rid of the error in our routes file. Func, and it takes the receiver of a pointer to application. And I'll call this movies GraphQL, which is what I called it in my routes file. And of course, because it's a handler, it takes a response writer, http.response-writer, and a pointer to a request. http.request. Okay, so that gets rid of the error in our routes file. So we know that the very first thing I want to get, we just want to get a very simple GraphQL request and response working properly. And as you might have guessed from the path name or the route name in our routes file, /list, I just want to return a list of movies. Okay? So we need to actually get that information from our database, and fortunately that's pretty easy. And just to save some time, I'll go movies and I'll ignore the error, okay? And that's going to be equal to, because we already have this movie variable declared, but it'll be equal to, same as we did before, app.models.db all. And that will populate the package level variable movies, okay? Then I know I'm going to be getting the request from my front end in the form of JSON. So let's read that. We can do that without doing anything else. Q, which is just a variable I'm declaring. And again, to save time, I'm going to ignore the error, and you shouldn't. You should do whatever error checking is appropriate for your application. And I'll just call from the standard library io.readAll. And I'm going to read the request body. Now readAll returns a slice of bytes, and that's not useful for me, so I'm going to cast that to a string. So I'll create a new variable called query, and that will just be, we'll cast Q to a string. So now we have that. And when I actually make the request from my front end, which we can't yet because we haven't written that code yet, just to make sure everything is working properly, I'll just say log.println and print that out. Okay, so now this will at least compile. So we have our route right here. /v1/GraphQL/list. It's not a protected route. We're making this one publicly available. And we're calling the handler movies GraphQL. And all we're doing so far is saying, get all the movies. So populate that variable. So this will actually populate the movies variable. And then we're reading the request body, getting our query, which will come in the form of JSON, and we need to do something with it. And this is where we actually need to describe the kind of data we're going to be sending back. So there's a few steps that we have to follow here. The first thing we need to do, and I'll do it right up here after my declaration of the movies variable, is I need to create a new variable, which I'll call fields, because I'm going to describe the fields that we'll be using in GraphQL. And here's where we start using that GraphQL package we just imported. So I'm going to say that's equal to the type GraphQL.fields. See if it'll do the import for me. And of course, this in curly brackets has to have some descriptions. So the very first thing I'm going to say is this is going to be a movie. Okay? And that is going to be read into GraphQL.field. And it's of type, a movie type, which we don't have yet. But don't worry about that. We'll get that before too long. Okay? And the description is going to be get movie by ID. We'll define a couple of ways of accessing the data to get the entire list of movies and to get a single movie. And we'll use both. And that has some arguments. And again, this is from the GraphQL type. So args is going to be GraphQL again dot field config argument. And we're describing what this is. And the field is ID. And it has to be a reference to GraphQL.argumentConfig. GraphQL argument config. And the type is GraphQL int. Okay. Now don't worry too much about the syntax for this. This will make sense once we actually start doing things with it. But as you can see, what I've described there in the arguments is to say, I'm going to have a movie, and it's going to have an ID. And it's going to, at this point, and you got to put a comma there, or this won't compile, and a comma there, or this won't compile. Then we have resolve. What does this resolve to? Well, it resolves to a function, and it takes one parameter, and that's of type GraphQL resolve params, which is a built-in type from this package, resolve params. And it returns an interface, an unknown type, or any type, and an error, potentially. And from here, all we're going to say is ID, OK, standard check in a map, is p.args, looking for the key ID, casting that to an int, and we check to see if it's OK. If OK, and now we loop through movies to see if we can find one with the given ID, the ID that's supplied to us. So for, and I'll ignore the index, movie is assigned the value of range through movies, and if movie.id is equal to the supplied ID, the parameter we're looking for, we'll return movie and no error. Otherwise, down here, we'll return nil and nil. And we need a comma right here, or this won't compile. And we need a comma right here, or this won't compile. So that's our first one. And we don't have, I got a typo here, GRAPH, QL.int. We don't have movie type defined yet, but don't worry about that. We're going to get to that next. So that's for looking for a movie by ID. Now, at the same level as movie, we can now specify another one, which I'll call list. And that's the one that our current route is going to target. So again, ampersand GraphQL.field. And the type in this case is going to be a GraphQL new list, because we're not returning a single item, we're returning a list of items. And again, this is of type movie type, which we'll get to shortly. And we'll give it a description, which is optional, but good practice. Description, try that again. Description. And that will just be get all movies. And after that, we have a very simple resolver. Resolve the request to, again, a function, again with params, and again there, GraphQL resolve.resolve params, and it will return just the same as before, interface, and potentially an error. And here all we do is return movies with no error. And put a comma there, and put a comma there. Okay, and I misspelled resolve params. OLV params. Okay, so now we have, this is what's called our schema. So I'll just put a comment there so you know what it is. GraphQL schema definition. This defines the schema, and that allows us to permit remote users to request whatever they want, or any kind of data that they want. So when they ask for a movie, if they just want the movie ID and the movie name, or just the movie name and just the movie release date, that's all we're going to send back. So it makes it a very efficient method of constructing queries. So now let's take care of that movie type. Var movie type. And this is equal to, and this is what describes what's in our database to GraphQL. So this is a GraphQL new object. And in here, we need to describe its configuration. And this is basically going through the fields we want to expose to GraphQL from our database. So, first thing we type is GraphQL object config. And this configures the object. And the first item in that is name. And we'll just call this movie with a capital M. And its fields consist of GraphQL.fields, plural. And inside of this, we have one entry for each of the fields we want to expose. So we want to expose ID, and again, ampersand GraphQL.field, singular, and we describe its type, which is GraphQL, not Boolean, int. Okay, now to save a little bit of time, let's put all of our necessary commas in before we forget. There it is. Okay, let's copy this ID and paste it and modify it. The next thing I want is title, straight from the database, and the type is a string in this case. And if you look at the definition of our table in the database, again, the next one is description, which is a string. And again, I'll paste this in. And after description comes year, which is an int. And after year comes release date. And this one is a date time. That's how timestamps are handled in GraphQL. And after that comes runtime, which is an int. And after that comes rating, which is an int. And after that comes MPAA rating, which is a string in this case. And then we have created at and updated at, which is a date time, and updated at. So updated at, and that's a date time. So at this point, we have no errors in our code, and that's good. So let's go through this again. First thing we do in the package where the handler to take care of the GraphQL endpoint exists is we declare a variable to hold the data we're going to be querying. In our case, it's a slice of pointers to models.movie, and that's all we care about at this point. Then we define our schema, and this tells GraphQL what kind of queries we're going to be getting. And in our case, we only have two. One for an individual movie on line 17, and we're going to get that by ID. And the second one, right now, is just list. That says, give me all the movies. So we're starting with really simple stuff, just to make sure we can get it working, and then we'll improve upon it from there. And then we have to describe what kind of information in our variable movies, which is a slice of pointers to models.movie, what kind of information do we want to expose to the end users? So for example, if I didn't want to expose created at and updated at, I just wouldn't include it in this definition, and it would be ignored by GraphQL. So people could ask for the created at or updated at, but they wouldn't get it. So that describes our data, and that's what we're really concerned with in this point. Now the next thing we need to do is to actually implement the logic to parse queries and populate the appropriate results and send that back as JSON. And that's going to be taken of here, line 84, movies GraphQL, our handler. And we'll get started on that in the next lecture.